a black professor, returning from a groundbreaking academic conference, was eager to reunite with his family. But as he approached the VIP lounge, everything took a devastating turn. A security guard, fueled by baseless prejudice, stopped him, demanding proof he didn't ask of others. Humiliated in front of a growing crowd, the professor quietly stood his ground. Just 10 minutes later, what happened next left everyone speechless and sparked a powerful reckoning that would ripple far beyond the airport walls. Stay with me, this is a story that will move you and make you think. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that matter. The terminal at Horizon Airways was a swirl of sound and motion, the sharp clang of luggage carts, the persistent hum of announcements, and the clipped conversations of travelers trying to make their gates. In the middle of it all, Naomi Whitaker sat quietly in her wheelchair, a pillar of calm amid the chaos. Her emerald green scarf, wrapped neatly around her neck, was a deliberate choice. It stood out, a symbol of her refusal to be overlooked. Even as the world seemed determined to see through her, Naomi was no stranger to airports, nor to the unspoken hierarchies within them. For years, her advocacy for accessibility had taken her across the country, to conferences and boardrooms where she fought to make spaces more equitable. Yet every trip reminded her that the battle was far from over. The challenges weren't always loud or overt. They crept in through sidelong glances, muted laughter, and the subtle tightening of smiles. As she approached the first-class counter, the rhythm of the airport seemed to slow, the chaos fading into a sharper awareness of the two attendants standing before her. "Welcome to Horizon Airways," the woman behind the counter said, her tone syrupy with false warmth. Her name tag read Heather Larson. Naomi caught the brief flicker of Heather's eyes to the wheelchair before they snapped back to her face. Naomi handed over her ID and ticket without hesitation. "Checking in for flight 257 to New York," she said evenly. Heather took the documents, her fingers hesitating on the keyboard. "First class?" she asked, her voice lilting with incredulity. "Yes," Naomi replied, her voice steady. Beside Heather, a man named Ethan Blake leaned slightly against the counter, his lips curling into a smirk. "Must be some kind of mix-up," he muttered, loud enough for Naomi to hear. Heather glanced at him, suppressing a laugh, before looking back at Naomi. "We just don't see well. It's unusual, that's all," she said, her tone heavy with condescension. Naomi's grip on the armrest of her wheelchair tightened, but her face betrayed nothing. "I'd like my boarding pass, please," she said. Heather's smile faltered, but she turned to the computer. Her fingers moved more slowly than necessary, each keystroke deliberate, as though she were performing an act of charity. Ethan, meanwhile, leaned closer to her, whispering something that made her giggle softly. Naomi sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the counter. She'd learned long ago that anger, no matter how justified, was a luxury she couldn't afford in moments like these. It would only confirm their unspoken assumptions. When Heather finally slid the boarding pass across the counter, it fell to the floor. "Oh no, how clumsy of me," Heather exclaimed, covering her mouth as Ethan stifled another laugh. Naomi bent down, retrieving the pass with the slow, deliberate movements of someone refusing to be rushed. Straightening, she locked eyes with Heather. "Everyone deserves respect," she said, her voice low but firm. Heather's expression wavered for a moment, the smirk slipping, but it returned just as quickly. "Of course," she chirped, her tone hollow. Naomi turned her chair toward the security line, her back straight, her head high. Behind her, she could hear Ethan whisper, "Some people just love being difficult. Blank. Underscore, blank." The security checkpoint was a hive of controlled chaos. Travelers shuffled forward in uneven lines, their movements jerky with impatience. Naomi joined the queue, her wheelchair gliding over the polished floor. She had done this 100 times before, yet the process always carried a faint undercurrent of dread. As she neared the front, she saw Heather and Ethan hovering nearby, their presence an unwelcome shadow. Heather was gesturing animatedly to a TSA officer, her voice carrying over the murmur of the crowd. When it was Naomi's turn, the officer, a stocky man with tired eyes, nodded her through. "We'll check the chair separately," he said, but Heather's voice cut through the air. "Wait a second," she called, striding over with Ethan in tow. "I think you should double-check her wheelchair. You never know what people might be hiding." Naomi froze, her heart pounding. She turned slowly to face Heather. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone sharp enough to cut through the tension. Heather smiled thinly. "Oh no, no problem. Just being thorough. You understand, don't you?" The TSA officer sighed, clearly reluctant but unwilling to challenge Heather. "We'll do a secondary inspection," he said, motioning Naomi to the side. As the agents began their search, their hands moving over the leather and metal of her chair, Naomi felt the familiar sting of humiliation. She kept her gaze forward, refusing to meet the eyes of the passengers who were now openly watching. Heather and Ethan stood nearby, their smug satisfaction palpable. The inspection dragged on longer than necessary, each moment a calculated reminder of power. When it was finally over, the officer cleared his throat. "You're all set," he said, his voice tinged with apology. Naomi nodded. "Thank you." As she turned to leave, Heather's voice rang out again, loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. "Better safe than sorry," she said with a laugh. Naomi stopped. For a moment, the weight of the day threatened to crush her. But then she turned her chair slightly, locking eyes with Heather. Her voice, when it came, was calm but unyielding. "Some actions have consequences," she said. Heather blinked, her confidence faltering for the first time. But she quickly recovered, rolling her eyes. "Whatever you say," she muttered, turning back to Ethan. Naomi didn't linger. She wheeled herself toward the gate, her chest tight but her resolve intact. The faint sting of humiliation burned, but beneath it was something stronger, a quiet determination that refused to be extinguished. She knew the day wasn't over, and neither was the fight. The security line was a restless river of humanity, snaking its way through the terminal with no regard for patience or grace. Naomi Whittaker felt the familiar weight of eyes on her as she moved forward in her wheelchair, her hands resting lightly on the armrests, her posture composed. She had been through this ritual too many times to let it show. But the stares, some curious, others judgmental, never failed to leave their mark. Ahead, a mother struggled to juggle two toddlers, their cries slicing through the hum of the terminal. A man in a crisp suit grumbled audibly about the inefficiency of the process, his sighs exaggerated for effect. Naomi kept her eyes forward, resisting the urge to react. She had learned to navigate these spaces with a practiced calm. But today felt different. The undercurrent of tension, stirred by her earlier encounter at the check-in counter, lingered like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. As Naomi reached the front of the line, the TSA officer, a weary-looking man with graying hair, greeted her with a nod. "ID and boarding pass, please." She handed them over, watching his expression shift from routine disinterest to a brief flicker of recognition. "You're good to go," he said, handing them back. "Just head through the scanner, and we'll inspect your chair separately." Naomi nodded, maneuvering herself toward the designated area. But before she could proceed, a sharp voice rang out behind her. "Wait a second." She turned to see Heather Larson, the check-in attendant, striding toward the security checkpoint with Ethan Blake trailing behind her. Naomi's stomach tightened, though she kept her expression neutral. Heather's smile was the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "I think you should double-check her wheelchair," she said to the TSA officer, her tone dripping with mock concern. "You never know what people might be hiding." The officer's brow furrowed. "Ma'am, we follow standard procedures for all passengers." Heather leaned in slightly, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "I'm just saying, better safe than sorry. You wouldn't want to overlook something and have it come back on you." Naomi felt her chest tighten, the humiliation rising like a tide. She turned to Heather, her voice calm but firm. "Is there a specific reason for your concern? Or is this just another way to assert your authority?" Heather's smile didn't falter, but there was a flash of irritation in her eyes. "Oh, no need to get defensive," she said sweetly. "We're just ensuring everyone's safety. You understand, don't you?" Naomi didn't answer. The TSA officer, clearly caught in the middle, sighed and gestured for Naomi to move to the side. "We'll conduct a secondary inspection," he said reluctantly. She wheeled herself to the inspection area, her hands steady despite the simmering anger beneath her composed exterior. The TSA agent began patting down her chair, his movements methodical but impersonal. Heather and Ethan hovered nearby, their presence a silent reminder of the power they held or thought they held in this moment. The murmurs of other passengers began to ripple through the line. Naomi caught snippets of their voices. Why are they making her go through all that? Maybe she did something. Probably just being thorough. You can't be too careful these days. The words stung not for their novelty but for their predictability. Naomi had heard them all before. As the inspection dragged on, she kept her gaze fixed ahead, refusing to let Heather or Ethan see her falter. She could feel their satisfaction radiating like a heatwave, but she would not give them the victory of her discomfort. Finally, the TSA agent stepped back and cleared his throat. You're all set, ma'am. Sorry for the inconvenience. Naomi nodded, her voice steady. Thank you. But as she turned to leave, Heather's voice rang out again, loud enough to reach the surrounding crowd. See? Better safe than sorry. The laughter that followed, soft and smug, felt like a slap. Naomi stopped, her hands tightening on the armrests. She turned her chair slightly, her gaze locking onto Heather's. You might want to remember, she said, her voice low but clear. That dignity doesn't belong to you. It belongs to me, and I will not let you take it. Heather blinked, caught off guard by the quiet force of Naomi's words. For a brief moment, her smug expression faltered, but she quickly recovered, rolling her eyes as if dismissing the entire encounter. Naomi didn't wait for a response. She turned and wheeled herself toward the gate, her back straight and her head held high. Behind her, the whispers of the crowd faded into the background, replaced by the rhythmic hum of her chair's motor. As she approached the gate, Naomi noticed a man in a dark suit standing off to the side. His posture was relaxed, but there was something about his sharp, watchful gaze that caught her attention. He wasn't staring at her, not directly, but his presence felt deliberate, as if he were taking stock of the scene before him. Naomi glanced at him briefly before turning her focus back to the gate desk, where Heather and Ethan had reappeared, their body language as smug and relaxed as ever. They laughed quietly together, oblivious to the glances they were drawing from other passengers. Naomi clenched her jaw, the earlier indignities still fresh in her mind. She had always believed in the power of resilience, in the importance of rising above the small-mindedness of others. But resilience, she knew, was not an infinite resource. It required fuel, and today, hers was running low. As she settled into a seat near the gate, Naomi took a deep breath, her eyes drifting back to the man in the suit. He was still watching, his expression unreadable. For a moment, their eyes met, and she felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name: recognition, perhaps, or the faintest trace of understanding. The tension in her chest eased slightly. Whatever lay ahead, she reminded herself, would not define her. The world might see her as small, as weak, as disposable, but she knew better. The quiet storm brewing inside her wasn't one of despair. It was one of purpose. Naomi sat near the gate, her wheelchair positioned against the wall where the noise of the airport softened to a low hum. She adjusted her emerald scarf, her fingers brushing over its familiar texture, an anchor against the unease that had built up over the day. She scanned the room, observing without engaging a habit she had developed over years of navigating public spaces that weren't built with her in mind. The gate area bustled with passengers, their movements seemingly ordinary but layered with the quiet hierarchies of travel. Families with children spread across multiple seats. Business travelers with laptops dominated the power outlets, and first-class passengers lingered near the counter, expecting an early boarding call. But Naomi noticed the subtle dynamics, the slight shifting of a man in his seat as she passed, the stolen glances that lingered too long, the careful avoidance of eye contact by others. Heather and Ethan were at the gate desk now, chatting with another staff member. Heather gestured animatedly, her laughter ringing out in sharp bursts, while Ethan leaned back, scrolling on his phone. Naomi could feel their presence like static in the air, a reminder that their earlier mockery had gone unchecked. Across the room, the man in the dark suit from earlier still stood apart. He leaned casually against a column, his sharp eyes flicking between Naomi and the gate desk. He wasn't ostentatious, but his posture carried an authority that demanded notice. Naomi wondered who he was, perhaps another business traveler, or maybe someone with a closer connection to Horizon Airways. Her thoughts were interrupted by a commotion nearby. A young black man wearing a hoodie and carrying a backpack was being questioned by a gate agent. His tone was calm, but his body was tense. His shoulders squared as if bracing for a fight he didn't want. "I've already shown you my boarding pass," the young man said, his voice steady but clipped. "Why do I need to show it again?" The gate agent, a middle-aged white woman with a tight smile, glanced at him skeptically. "I just want to confirm. It's routine," she said, though the implication that it wasn't routine for everyone hung in the air. Naomi felt a familiar pang of frustration. She had seen this play out before: the scrutiny, the veiled suspicion, the unspoken question of belonging. The young man handed over his pass again, his movements deliberate. Heather, catching wind of the interaction, sauntered over, her tone breezy but loaded. "Is there a problem here?" "No problem," the young man replied, his voice firm. "Just trying to board my flight." Heather glanced at the boarding pass, then at the man, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Hoodies can make it hard to identify someone," she said, her voice dripping with faux concern. "Maybe next time, dress a little more appropriately for travel." The young man froze, his jaw tightening. Around them, passengers began to look up. Their interest peaked but their expressions carefully neutral. Naomi clenched her fists, feeling the weight of the man's humiliation as if it were her own. "That's enough," came a low, steady voice. The man in the dark suit stepped forward, his presence immediately shifting the energy in the room. Heather turned, her practiced smile faltering. "Who are you?" she asked, her tone uncertain for the first time. "James Carter," he said, his words measured and deliberate, "CEO of Horizon Airways." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gate area as passengers pieced together what was happening. Heather's face paled, her confidence evaporating as quickly as it had appeared. "I've been observing your interactions for a while now," James continued, his gaze unwavering, "and what I've seen is deeply troubling. This is not how we treat our passengers or anyone else." Heather opened her mouth to protest, but James held up a hand. "Save it, I don't want excuses." Ethan, who had been standing silently by the counter, straightened. "Mr. Carter, we were just trying to ensure." "I know exactly what you were trying to ensure," James interrupted, his voice sharp. "But let me be clear. Your behavior is unacceptable. Both of you will report to HR immediately after this flight. Consider this your final warning, if not your last day." The room fell silent, the weight of James's words settling over everyone. Naomi watched, her emotions a mix of relief and disbelief. She hadn't expected anyone, least of all the CEO of the airline, to step in so decisively. James turned to Naomi then, his expression softening. "Ms. Whitaker, may I speak with you for a moment?" Naomi hesitated, her guard still up, but she nodded. James gestured toward a quieter corner of the gate area, away from prying eyes. As they moved, she felt the stares of the other passengers. Their curiosity mingled with something else, perhaps guilt for not having intervened themselves. When they reached the corner, James spoke, his voice quieter but no less firm. "I owe you an apology. What you've experienced today from check-in to security to this moment is not reflective of the values we claim to uphold at Horizon Airways. It's unacceptable, and I take full responsibility." Naomi studied him, searching for any hint of pretense. But his expression was sincere, his tone heavy with conviction. "Words are easy, Mr. Carter," she said finally. "What matters is what you do next." James nodded, his jaw tightening. "You're right, and I intend to act. But I also want your input, your experience, your perspective. It's invaluable. If you're willing, I'd like to offer you a role in shaping the changes we need to make." Naomi raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by the sudden offer. "And what kind of role would that be?" "A leadership role," James replied. "An accessibility task force with full autonomy and resources to make meaningful changes not just for Horizon Airways, but for the industry as a whole." Naomi felt the weight of his words, the magnitude of the opportunity. It was tempting, but her skepticism remained. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said, "and it doesn't happen just because you throw resources at it. It takes commitment, accountability, and you'll have both," James said, "from me and from this company. I promise you that." Naomi didn't answer immediately. The anger and frustration of the day still burned beneath her calm exterior. But so did something else, a flicker of hope. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice steady. "But you should know, Mr. Carter, I don't do things halfway." James's lips curved into a faint smile. "Neither do I." As they returned to the gate, Naomi felt the eyes of the other passengers on her once more. But this time, she didn't care. Whatever came next, she was ready to face it. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. The boarding area buzzed with the low hum of idle chatter and rustling belongings. Yet Naomi Whittaker felt a familiar tension building beneath the surface. The air seemed heavy, not with the chaos of travel but with the weight of the unspoken, a mix of curiosity, guilt, and unease from the crowd that had witnessed the confrontation between James Carter and the gate agents. Naomi adjusted her scarf, her fingers lingering on its fabric as if to ground herself. She knew too well that justice, when it arrived, often brought more questions than answers. Heather and Ethan were gone, escorted from the gate by another airline staff member after James Carter's swift reprimand. Their absence left an undeniable shift in the room. But Naomi was under no illusions that their departure meant the problem was solved. People like them weren't isolated, they were symptoms of a larger culture. One that thrived in subtlety and plausible deniability. A boarding announcement broke through the murmur of the crowd, signaling the start of pre-boarding. As passengers gathered their belongings, Naomi remained seated, her eyes scanning the room. She saw the awkward glances from those who had stood by silently during her earlier humiliation. Their discomfort was palpable, yet none approached her, not yet. In their avoidance, Naomi saw the true face of complicity, not malice, but indifference. A flight attendant, a young woman with dark, curly hair and kind eyes, approached Naomi. Her name tag read Elena Ruiz. "Ms. Whittaker," Elena said, her voice gentle yet firm. "We'd like to assist you to board first." Naomi studied her for a moment, searching for any trace of condescension. There was none, only genuine concern. "Thank you," Naomi replied, her tone even, though a flicker of exhaustion seeped through. "I can manage." Elena hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside to let Naomi move toward the jet bridge. As she did, the subtle stir of passengers parting to make way felt like more than a courtesy, it felt like an unspoken acknowledgement of the morning's events. The jet bridge was dimly lit, its narrow corridor amplifying every sound. The faint hum of the plane's engines, the soft squeak of Naomi's wheelchair, the shuffle of passengers' footsteps behind her. Naomi moved steadily forward, her mind replaying James Carter's offer. The Accessibility Task Force was an opportunity she couldn't dismiss lightly. Yet she couldn't shake the cynicism born of years spent navigating spaces that often felt designed to exclude her. When she reached the plane's threshold, another flight attendant greeted her. This one, a tall man with a professional smile, gestured toward her seat. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Whittaker," he said. "Let me know if you need anything." Naomi nodded, maneuvering to her assigned seat in 2A, a first-class window seat. The space was generous, the leather upholstery smooth, but it did little to erase the tension knotted in her shoulders. She adjusted her scarf once more, her fingers moving absent-mindedly as she settled in. As the rest of the first-class passengers boarded, Naomi noticed the man who had been watching her earlier, the one in the dark suit taking his seat across the aisle in 2C. James Carter. He carried himself with the same quiet authority she had observed at the gate. But now there was a weariness to him, a weight that seemed to rest not just on his shoulders but in his eyes. He nodded to her briefly before turning his attention to his tablet. The boarding process continued, the shuffle of coach passengers filling the aisles with the usual chaos. Naomi glanced toward the back of the plane, her gaze catching a mother struggling to settle her two young children. The scene was ordinary, but it reminded Naomi of the barriers so many faced not just in airports, but everywhere. The smallest inconveniences, magnified by systems that refused to see their humanity. Her thoughts were interrupted by a commotion at the front of the cabin. A man in his late 50s, wearing an expensive suit and an air of self-importance, stood arguing with Elena, the flight attendant who had greeted Naomi earlier. "I don't understand why I was moved," the man said, his voice loud enough to draw attention. "I specifically booked 2A. This is unacceptable." Elena maintained her composure, her tone calm but firm. "I understand your frustration, sir, but the seat was reassigned. I assure you, we'll do everything we can to make you comfortable." The man's gaze darted to Naomi, his eyes narrowing. "You mean it was reassigned to her?" he said, his voice dropping but not enough to mask the disdain in his tone. "I paid for first class, not to have my seat given away." Naomi felt the sting of his words, though they didn't surprise her. She had seen this play out before, the assumption that she didn't belong, that her presence was an inconvenience. She straightened in her seat, her expression calm but unyielding. James Carter stood abruptly, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. The man turned to James, clearly not recognizing him. "Yes, there is," he said, his tone still laced with indignation. "I was moved from my seat without explanation to accommodate her." James's expression didn't waver. "You were moved because this airline prioritizes the comfort and dignity of all its passengers," he said, his words deliberate. "And if you have an issue with that, I suggest you take it up with me. I'm James Carter, CEO of Horizon Airways." The man's face flushed, his confidence faltering. He stammered, before falling silent. Naomi watched the exchange, a mixture of satisfaction and weariness settling over her. She appreciated James's intervention, but the man's reaction was a reminder that prejudice, even when challenged, rarely disappeared. It simply retreated, waiting for another opportunity to assert itself. James turned to Naomi, his expression softening. "Ms. Whitaker," he said, his voice quieter now, "I apologize for the disruption. If there's anything you need during this flight, please don't hesitate to ask." Naomi inclined her head, her voice steady. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I appreciate it." As the plane taxied to the runway, Naomi gazed out the window, the city below shrinking into a mosaic of lights. Her reflection stared back at her, a reminder of the barriers she had faced to reach this moment. The man's indignation, Heather and Ethan's mockery, the passive silence of bystanders, it all spoke to the quiet violence of everyday racism. It wasn't always shouted or written in bold letters. Often, it whispered, insinuating itself into the spaces between words and actions. Naomi closed her eyes, the hum of the engines filling her ears. The fight was far from over. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet resolve. The world outside was vast, its challenges daunting, but she would face them as she always had, with dignity and tact. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the cabin lights dimmed to a muted glow. Naomi Whitaker sat in her seat, staring out at the endless night sky. Stars blinked faintly, indifferent to the small dramas playing out miles below. The quiet in the cabin was deceptive, an interlude in the steady hum of tension that had followed her all day. She adjusted her scarf and leaned back in her chair, aware that the silence was fragile, like glass waiting to be shattered. Across the aisle, James Carter worked intently on his tablet, his polished demeanor giving nothing away. Naomi could feel his presence, steady and deliberate, like a promise left unspoken. Yet her thoughts weren't on him. They were on the man who had challenged her presence in 2A. Now seated somewhere in coach, nursing his indignation, his words echoed in her mind, not for their novelty but for their familiarity. "I paid for first class, not to have my seat given away." The flight attendant, Elena, returned to check on Naomi. Her smile was warm, her movements careful, but Naomi couldn't ignore the subtle hesitation in her approach. It wasn't fear, exactly, but an awareness, a careful calibration of tone and body language that spoke volumes. Elena was kind, but she had also seen the dynamics of the day unfold, and she was walking a tightrope between empathy and overcompensation. "Ms. Whitaker, can I get you anything?" Elena asked softly. "A drink? A blanket?" Naomi shook her head. "I'm fine, thank you." Elena lingered for a moment, as if searching for the right words, before retreating down the aisle. Naomi watched her go, feeling a pang of sympathy. Elena's kindness wasn't performative, but it was constrained, shaped by a system that had trained her to see passengers like Naomi as exceptions to the rule. As the flight settled into its rhythm, the muted sound of conversations filled the cabin. Naomi found herself listening not to the words, but to the tones and pauses, the spaces where meaning lived. The murmur of voices in first class was different from the energy of coach, where the din was louder, more chaotic. It wasn't just a physical divide, it was a social one, reinforced by every interaction, every glance. The man in 2C, a businessman with a watch that gleamed like a trophy, laughed quietly with the flight attendant serving him. His tone was relaxed, his words easy. Naomi caught his glance as he turned, and for a moment, their eyes met. His smile faltered, almost imperceptibly, Before he turned away, focusing on his drink, Naomi exhaled slowly. The divide wasn't always in what people said, it was in what they didn't. The quiet was broken by the faint sound of a baby crying. It came from Coach, muffled by the barrier that separated the two cabins. A woman's voice, fraught, apologetic, rose above the baby's wails, trying to soothe the child. Naomi could sense the ripple of irritation in first class without needing to look. A man across the aisle muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. The flight attendant glanced toward the curtain, her expression caught between professionalism and the impatience she didn't dare express. The cries continued, persistent and unyielding. Naomi thought of the mother behind the curtain, struggling with her child under the judgmental gaze of strangers. It was a scene she had witnessed countless times. The unwritten rules of air travel dictating who deserved patience and who did not. Unbelievable, the man in 2C muttered, loud enough for Naomi to hear. She turned her head slightly, her voice calm but pointed. Babies don't cry on schedule. The man stiffened, caught off guard. Well, some of us are trying to sleep, he said, his tone defensive. Naomi raised an eyebrow. And some of us are trying to exist in a world that wasn't designed for us. We all have our challenges. The man's face flushed, but he didn't reply. He turned back to his drink, his silence a small victory. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, a sudden jolt that made the cabin lurch. Naomi gripped the armrests of her chair, her breath catching as the overhead bins rattled. Around her, passengers murmured uneasily, some reaching for their seatbelts. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and measured, reassuring them that the turbulence was temporary. Naomi let out a slow breath, her grip relaxing. The turbulence passed quickly, but it left her feeling unsettled, her mind drifting to the fragility of the moment. The divide between first class and coach, between kindness and prejudice, was just as precarious, a thin veneer that could shatter at any moment. Later, as the flight attendants dimmed the cabin lights further, Naomi noticed Elena speaking quietly with James Carter near the galley. Their conversation was subdued, but Naomi caught snippets of their words. The incident earlier, unacceptable, addressing it. James glanced toward Naomi briefly, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, his posture firm as he spoke to Elena. Whatever they were discussing, Naomi knew it had to do with her. She looked away, turning her attention back to the window. The stars were brighter now, their light piercing the darkness like tiny shards of hope. Naomi closed her eyes, her thoughts circling back to the events of the day. Racism wasn't always loud or overt. More often, it lingered in the quiet spaces, in the hesitation of a smile, the choice of a seat, the unspoken judgment behind a glance. It thrived in the divide between what people thought and what they said, between what they believed and what they allowed themselves to act upon. Naomi had learned to navigate these spaces, to steel herself against the subtle violence of everyday prejudice. But today, the weight of it felt heavier, the cumulative toll of years spent fighting to be seen. Yet as she opened her eyes and gazed at the stars again, she felt a flicker of resolve. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But neither was she. The quiet of the cabin deepened as the plane soared through the night, carrying Naomi toward a horizon she couldn't yet see but refused to stop chasing. The cabin had grown quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes at 30,000 feet. Suspended between earth and sky, most of the passengers had settled into the rhythm of the flight. Their murmured conversations replaced by the glow of screens or the slow, steady breathing of sleep. But Naomi Whitaker's mind refused rest. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed the storm beneath her calm exterior. Her thoughts returned to the man in the expensive suit, the one whose entitlement had filled the cabin like a stifling fog. She could still hear his voice in her mind, dripping with indignation. "I paid for first class." He hadn't needed to finish the sentence, she already knew what he meant. She had known it her whole life. It wasn't just the seat he thought was his, it was the space, the air, the unspoken hierarchy that allowed him to believe she didn't belong. The plane shuddered slightly, hitting another brief patch of turbulence. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and practiced, assuring the passengers that everything was under control. Naomi glanced around the cabin, noting the subtle changes in posture, the tightening of hands on armrests, the flicker of unease in eyes that darted toward the window. Across the aisle, James Carter remained composed, though his gaze was distant, as if he were somewhere else entirely. Naomi wondered what weighed on him as CEO of one of the nation's largest airlines. Now confronting a reality he could no longer ignore. He had acted decisively at the gate, but she knew that one public reprimand wouldn't fix what was broken. The problem wasn't just Heather or Ethan, it was the culture that had allowed them to behave that way without fear of consequence. As the plane steadied again, Elena, the flight attendant, approached James with a fresh cup of coffee. Her smile was warm, but Naomi noticed the way her hands lingered on the tray. As if seeking reassurance, she said something to James in a low voice. And he nodded, his expression softening slightly. Whatever they were discussing, Naomi could sense its weight. The soft chime of the call button broke the moment. Elena turned, her gaze scanning the cabin before settling on a man in the row behind Naomi. He was white, middle-aged, and impeccably dressed, his tie still perfectly knotted despite the late hour. "I've been waiting for my drink," he said, his voice carrying the sharp edge of entitlement. Elena nodded quickly. "I'll get that for you right away, sir." But as she turned to leave, the man added, "It's not like there's much to do up here. First class should mean first-class service. Don't you think?" The words hung in the air, heavy and pointed. Naomi caught the glance he threw in her direction. Fleeting but unmistakable. He wasn't just talking about service, he was talking about her. About the perceived disruption she represented to the sanctity of his experience. Elena hesitated for the briefest moment, her professional smile faltering before she hurried toward the galley. Naomi felt her jaw tighten, the familiar heat of anger rising in her chest. She turned slightly, meeting the man's gaze with an unflinching stare. "I didn't realize being served was such a hardship," she said, her voice low but steady. The man blinked, caught off guard by her directness. "Excuse me? You heard me," Naomi replied, her tone unwavering. "Some of us have learned to wait a lifetime for basic respect. Surely you can wait a few minutes for a drink." The man's face flushed, his lips pressing into a thin line. He didn't reply, instead turning his attention to the window. The silence that followed was thick, a quiet acknowledgement from the surrounding passengers who had overheard but chose not to intervene. Naomi leaned back in her seat, the tension in her body refusing to dissipate. It wasn't just the man's comment that lingered, it was the way no one had stepped in. The way their silence echoed louder than his words. This was the unspoken reality of racism, she thought. It wasn't always the direct insults or overt discrimination, it was the passive acceptance. The quiet complicity of those who chose comfort over confrontation. Across the aisle, James Carter shifted in his seat, his gaze meeting Naomi's. There was something in his eyes, a mixture of apology and determination, that made her pause. He inclined his head slightly, a silent acknowledgement of what had just transpired. Later, as the cabin lights dimmed further, James rose from his seat and approached Naomi. He crouched slightly to meet her eye level, his expression serious but not unkind. "Ms. Whitaker," he began, his voice low enough not to disturb the other passengers. "I want to thank you for your patience today. I know it hasn't been easy." Naomi studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "It's never easy," she said finally, "but I'm used to it." "That's exactly the problem," James replied, his tone firm. "You shouldn't have to be used to it. And it's my responsibility to make sure our airline doesn't perpetuate that kind of treatment." Naomi raised an eyebrow. Words like that sound good in press releases, Mr. Carter, but they don't mean much without action. James nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know, and that's why I want to make sure the task force we discussed isn't just symbolic. I want it to have real power, real influence, and I want you to lead it." Naomi's eyes narrowed. "You think putting me in charge will solve the problem?" "I think your voice is the one we need," James replied, "but I also know it's not fair to put the burden solely on you. That's why I'm committing resources, staff, and authority to back you up. This isn't just about fixing one airline, it's about setting a new standard for the industry." Naomi held his gaze, searching for any hint of pretense. But all she saw was sincerity, tinged with the weariness of a man who had finally realized the depth of the problem he was trying to address. "I'll consider it," she said finally, her voice measured, "but I'll be honest with you, Mr. Carter. I've seen too many promises fade into nothing. If I do this, I won't let it become another empty gesture." "Neither will I," James replied. As James returned to his seat, Naomi turned her gaze back to the window. The stars were still there, constant and unyielding against the darkness. She thought of the challenges she had faced today, each one small but significant, building like waves against the shore. The quiet divide of racism wasn't something that could be dismantled overnight. It was ingrained in systems, in culture, in the very fabric of how people saw one another. But for the first time in a long time, Naomi felt a flicker of hope, not just in James's words, but in her own resolve. The fight was far from over, but she was ready to face it, one challenge at a time. The plane hummed softly as it carried her through the night, toward a horizon that felt just within reach. The city lights of New York came into view, their glow breaking through the night's darkness. The plane had begun its descent, but the cabin remained hushed, the faint hum of the engines the only sound. Naomi Whittaker sat upright, her hands resting lightly on the armrests of her wheelchair. Her reflection in the window stared back at her, shadowed but resolute, as if daring her to confront the weight of the day's events. The flight had been long, not in time but in the slow, grinding way every interaction seemed to carry a reminder. The world was always ready to test the boundaries of her patience. Her dignity, her very existence, the man who had grumbled about her presence, the gate agents who had mocked her, the silent passengers who had watched it all without stepping in. They weren't isolated figures. They were threads in a fabric woven tightly over centuries, a pattern of exclusion and quiet complicity that persisted even when the surface seemed smooth. As the plane leveled out, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." The routine announcement was meant to reassure, but to Naomi, it felt like a reminder of the hierarchies that governed even this enclosed space. The turbulence had passed, but she could still feel it, not in the plane's motion, but in the interactions that lingered like a faint bruise. Across the aisle, James Carter sat quietly, his expression contemplative, the man who had dismissed her earlier, the one exiled to coach after insisting he deserved her seat, was nowhere in sight. His absence was a small victory, but it didn't erase the sting of his words or the many times Naomi had heard similar sentiments. She glanced at James, wondering if he fully understood the enormity of what he had asked her, to lead a task force that would challenge not just policies, but attitudes, assumptions, and deeply ingrained biases. The weight of it felt almost crushing, but Naomi had carried heavier burdens before. As the wheels touched down, the cabin erupted into its usual flurry of activity: seatbelts unbuckling, bags being retrieved, passengers shifting impatiently in their seats. Naomi remained still, letting the rush flow around her like a current. She had learned to wait, to measure her movements in a world that rarely gave her the space to move freely. When it was her turn to disembark, Elena, the flight attendant, appeared at her side. "Ms. Whittaker," she said softly, "someone from the airline's executive team is waiting to meet you at the gate." Naomi raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Thank you." Elena hesitated, her expression thoughtful. "I just want to say, you handled everything today with so much grace. It's inspiring." Naomi smiled faintly, though her voice remained steady. "Thank you, but it shouldn't take grace to be treated like a human being." Elena nodded, her cheeks flushing slightly. "You're right, I'll remember that." The terminal was quieter now, the rush of arriving passengers dispersing into the vastness of the airport. Naomi wheeled herself toward the gate, her movements deliberate. She saw James Carter waiting for her, his posture as calm and composed as ever, but there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Ms. Whittaker," he said, stepping forward, "thank you for your patience today. I'd like to take a moment to speak with you, if you're willing." Naomi studied him, her silence deliberate. She wanted him to feel the weight of her consideration, the unspoken challenge in her gaze. Finally, she nodded. "Let's talk." James gestured toward a quieter area of the terminal, away from the ebb and flow of travelers. They settled near a wide window overlooking the tarmac, the lights of planes flickering in the distance. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching like the space between them. "I owe you more than an apology," James began, his voice low but firm. "What happened today was unacceptable. Not just the actions of my staff, but the culture that allowed it to happen in the first place. That's on me." Naomi tilted her head slightly, her gaze unflinching. Acknowledging the problem is a start, Mr. Carter, but it's not enough. James nodded. I know, and that's why I'm serious about the task force we discussed. This isn't just about fixing what went wrong today, it's about dismantling the structures that allow this kind of behavior to thrive. I want Horizon Airways to lead the industry in accessibility and inclusivity. But I need your help to do it. Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. It's a bold promise, but promises don't pay the cost of change. I know what you're asking, and I don't take it lightly. You're asking me to lead the charge, to put myself on the front line again. That's not just work, it's a battle. And it's a battle I've been fighting my entire life. James leaned forward, his hands clasped. I won't pretend to fully understand what that's like. But I can promise you this, if you take this on, you won't be alone. You'll have the resources, the authority, and my full support. This won't just be a corporate initiative, it'll be a movement. Naomi held his gaze, the weight of his words settling over her. She thought of the countless times she had been asked to fix what others had broken, to bridge divides she hadn't created. But this felt different, not easier, but necessary. I'll consider it, she said finally, her voice steady, but on one condition. This can't just be about appearances. If I'm going to do this, I need to know that you're committed to real change, no matter how uncomfortable it gets. James's expression softened, a faint smile curving his lips. You have my word, Ms. Whitaker, and my respect. Naomi nodded, her resolve firming. The challenges ahead loomed large, but she had faced larger. As they shook hands, she felt a flicker of hope, not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been overlooked, dismissed, and silenced. As she exited the terminal, the cool night air greeted her, carrying with it the faint hum of the city. Naomi glanced back at the airport, its lights glittering like distant stars. The day had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated, but it had also reminded her of something vital. The fight for dignity was never over. But neither was the possibility of change. And for that, she was ready. The hotel room was quiet. The kind of quiet that felt fragile, like it could break under the weight of a single thought. Naomi Whitaker sat by the window, her wheelchair angled toward the city skyline. Beyond the glass, New York stretched out before her, its lights glittering against the pre-dawn darkness. The world seemed endless from this vantage point. And yet she could feel its walls closing in, walls built by generations of exclusion and indifference. Walls she had spent a lifetime trying to dismantle. The envelope James Carter had handed her lay unopened on the desk. Inside was a formal letter of apology and a year-long first-class travel pass. It was a gesture, not a solution, and Naomi knew better than to mistake one for the other. The task force he proposed, though, was something else entirely. It wasn't just an invitation. It was a challenge, a call to do what no one else had dared to try. Naomi's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Melanie, her assistant. Saw the news. You okay? Everyone's talking about it. Call me when you're ready. Naomi set the phone aside, her gaze drifting back to the city. News spread fast these days, especially when it involved a CEO publicly reprimanding his staff for discrimination. But she knew the headlines would focus on the spectacle, not the substance. The hard work, the endless meetings, the pushback, the quiet battles in boardrooms would go unseen. That was the nature of change. It happened in shadows, slow and uncelebrated. The next morning, Naomi sat in a conference room at Horizon Airways corporate headquarters. The walls were glass, the room bathed in the kind of light that demanded transparency, even if it rarely delivered it. Across the table sat James Carter and a handful of executives, their polished appearances masking varying degrees of discomfort. Naomi could see it in their body language, the way some leaned forward, eager to please, while others sat back, arms crossed, their skepticism poorly concealed. Ms. Whitaker, James began, his tone steady but formal. Thank you for joining us today. We're here because of you, because of what you endured, and because of the opportunity we have to do better. This task force is just the beginning, and I want you to know that we're fully committed to making real change. Naomi let his words settle before speaking. Mr. Carter, she said evenly, I appreciate your commitment, but let's not pretend this is about me. What happened at the airport wasn't an isolated incident, it's a reflection of a culture that allows people like Heather and Ethan to act with impunity. If this task force is going to mean anything, it can't just be about fixing policies. It has to be about dismantling the biases that created them. One of the executives, a man whose name tag read Richard Quinn, cleared his throat. With all due respect, Ms. Whitaker, we already have diversity initiatives in place. We've done unconscious bias training. The problem is, these incidents are difficult to control. Naomi turned to him, her expression sharp. Diversity initiatives are window dressing if they don't come with accountability. Training means nothing if your staff knows there are no consequences for their actions. You want to talk about control? Start by controlling the culture you've let fester. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the table. James interjected, his voice calm but firm. She's right. Accountability has to be the cornerstone of this effort. That's why I want this task force to have real authority, including the ability to review complaints and recommend disciplinary action. Naomi leaned forward. Authority isn't enough. This task force needs visibility. Passengers need to know that they can report incidents without fear of being dismissed. Staff need to see that discriminatory behavior won't be tolerated, not just punished, but actively rooted out. The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down like a judge's gavel. Naomi knew the discomfort she was causing, and she welcomed it. Change didn't come without unease, it thrived on it. Later that afternoon, Naomi walked through the bustling streets of New York, her wheelchair weaving through the crowds. The city moved around her, its energy relentless, its rhythms indifferent to her presence. She thought of the passengers on the flight of the man who had dismissed her, the silent onlookers, the flight attendants who had tried, in their own ways, to help. They were all pieces of the same puzzle, fragments of a society that struggled to reconcile its ideals with its reality. As she turned a corner, she spotted a small park, its benches scattered with people reading, chatting, or simply watching the world go by. She found a quiet spot near a fountain and sat for a while, letting the sound of water drown out the noise of the city. The weight of the day pressed against her, but she refused to let it break her. That evening, Naomi returned to her hotel room and opened her laptop. The blank document stared back at her, its cursor blinking like a heartbeat. She began to type, the words flowing slowly at first, then with growing momentum. Horizon Task Force for Equity and Accessibility, Objectives and Actions. 1. Establish mandatory inclusivity and accountability training for all staff, with input from passengers directly impacted by discrimination. 2. Create a transparent reporting system for passengers and employees, with independent oversight. 3. Conduct a full review of existing policies to identify and eliminate systemic biases. 4. Develop industry-wide standards for accessibility and inclusivity, setting a precedent for other airlines to follow. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keys. The task ahead was monumental, and she knew it wouldn't be easy. But as she stared at the list, she felt a flicker of hope, small but steady, like the first light of dawn breaking through the night. Naomi saved the document and closed the laptop. She glanced at the city skyline, its lights twinkling against the darkness, and allowed herself a rare moment of satisfaction. The fight wasn't over, it never would be, but she was ready. The next morning, as the sun rose over New York, Naomi received a call from James Carter. Ms. Whitaker, he said, his voice tinged with something she hadn't heard before, genuine admiration. I've read your proposal. Let's get to work. Naomi smiled, her resolve hardening. Let's. The path forward would be steep, but Naomi was no stranger to uphill battles. And this time, she wouldn't climb alone. The horizon awaited, and she was determined to meet it head on.